one thing that I did with all the Fastlane tools, which has proven really, really helpful, was I actually did, I don't know if it's an official term, I call it README driven development, even better than test driven development. So I write the README first.
Today's guest is going to be one of our most requested guests so far, and I feel like one of, especially to, like you guys know, I'm an iOS engineer. Like I grew up in the iOS environment, and we have the chance. Also, I'm from Germany, and we have the chance today to have Felix here, Felix Krause, inventor of Fastlane, amongst many other things. And we're gonna get into that. Felix uh, was nice enough to give us 20 minutes to basically shoot over all the questions we had, and we had a lot of questions. So we're not going to get to all of those questions, unfortunately, because we want to be respectful of Felix's time, but we do have the chance to actually cover, I feel like, a really broad range of questions. And so to basically just give a quick intro about Felix, and that's, I think, one of the biggest problems we're going to have today is that we have 20 minutes. Felix has done so many crazy things that I could probably spend at least 20 minutes just talking about what he did in 2021. But yeah, just to give like a very brief rundown, I think this is why you, Felix, have been like one of the requested guests on my Instagram account, is because I feel like you're a creator through and through. I feel like you're the engineer when people think about is like someone who's obviously invested in the technology, who just creates, who just solves problem all the time. I feel like you're, just to give like a quick rundown for the people who don't know you, all of my audience are engineers, and most of them, and the few who are not, are entrepreneurs. So I think you're covering both of them. For everyone who's not an iOS engineer, I think, and maybe even Android engineer, those are probably the only people who don't know you just by seeing your face. But you're the creator of Fastlane. You have saved myself, my team, all of my coworkers hours, and I love the ticker on your website, how many millions of developer hours you saved in the iOS and Android environment. It's like the brief rundown is it's basically like a release automation tool, so we can just press a button and things happen magically with CI integration. You push to the app, so you push the test flight. So a lot of things, like if you're not in the iOS environment, you can spend hours of this. You can build something great, and then it takes you hours to capture a screenshot, all these things. Felix started automating that, and I think you're now like your tool grew insanely. I feel like now it's even seeing it's one of the requirements if you want to work for Apple or like the big companies. Actually knowing and understanding Felix tools is now one of the requirements if you want to work as an engineer. So that's mind blowing. But also like all the small things you wrote, from Telegram bots to, I know, I think in 2019 you just, for your website yourself, you built something like the Instagram story viewer just for your website. You're tracking all the data. So there's so many good things to uncover. To basically, like, for other people who haven't seen this before and don't know you yet, I think what's really important for like the entrepreneurial kind of spirits in my audience is that you're from Austria, I think from close to Vienna, right? You're not from Vienna? Yeah. And then you started working on this tool Fastlane, and that got, I think, acquired by Twitter. And then from Twitter, you moved over to Google. So Felix has been around. Like he came from Austria, worked for the biggest companies in the world. Now you're back in Austria at the moment, and I know you're working internationally now on new projects. But first of all, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. You're infamous in the environment, and I'm basically trying to share now how you got started, what advice you would give yourself going back, what's something that you learned now being as successful as you are, and something you would like to share with us. So why don't we start in, hey, how did you actually got started in tech? Why tech?
Yeah, thanks for the intro. So initially I started and got into software through robotics actually. And so in the beginning was just Lego robots, Lego Mindstorms, which many of you I'm sure know, where you can first build it and then program it to like follow a line and stuff like that. And then after like years of building and programming those robots, I realized I'm more interested in the software aspect of it. So that's kind of like how I got into it. And then for me personally, one of the ground rules I've always followed was that everything I learned was there to serve a purpose. So I'm not a person who would just learn something like, let's say, the latest React features just for fun, but usually I learn things on the way of building something. So I always have a goal in mind, and I think that's where the entrepreneurial aspect comes in. Same for Fastlane. the mobile developer tool that I've created, everything I learned as part of that was really just to reach that goal. And those were just the tools that helped me to get there.
So I feel like
So I've been following that for all of my career, basically.
I feel like you just answered 18 of the questions that people submitted and I think there's so much good just in what you said is that because we had the last guest we had on, this was like a very similar message to be like, hey, don't get confused in learning broad, but really understand that there's a purpose, like follow the goal and learn what's necessary to get there. And now it sounds like this is the approach you've been following from day one. Did you start in iOS, or how did you shift over from robotics to then, you know what, I want to learn about iOS?
So after robotics, I was building some Windows applications in C#. Back then, there was like a free development environment. Back then you had to pay for much of that stuff. And when the first iPhone came out, my dad had the privilege. He got an iPhone from America somehow. And I remember it felt very magical, like the first days and weeks with multi-touch and like scrolling and the keyboard like through like just using your fingers and stuff. And back then I was like, okay, I definitely want to build something for that. And back in the days, you could only build software for the iPhone as a website, right? So they had like an app store that was just linking to websites basically. So that was kind of like how I got started into iOS development very early on. And then as soon as the app store opened up, I started learning how to build native apps. Back then, Objective-C was still too complicated for me. So I started with like a JavaScript framework called Accelerate Titanium, which recently shut down. So you would be able to write iPhone apps and Android apps with JavaScript. Before it was cool. I mean, now everybody does it. But yeah, that's kind of like how I started. And then after a while, it was time to actually learn Objective-C. And to this day, for example, I haven't learned Swift yet. Like everybody loves Swift, and I'm sure it's a great language. I haven't used it yet because I just didn't need it yet. Just because I'm working on other things now, be developer tools or my current job.
This is, I think, yet again, there's like so much good in there, just showing again, because I feel like especially now with WWDC, obviously started yesterday. For the people who don't know, it's a worldwide developer conference for Apple. Apple announces the new hot things that are coming out that are being released in the beta, or you can get like early developer access. However, here's Felix being probably one of the most influential in the iOS industry, not even learning Swift yet, because again, it's probably not about being on top of like the new things. Is like having this goal, following this purpose, and understanding the tools you probably need to get the job done. So this is like yet another thing. I'm basically just trying to summarize the lessons I can pick out in between so we can save a lot of questions. But I know you're also heavily invested in privacy, especially iOS privacy. I read your tweet, I think it was from this morning, where about the Xcode cloud, that will Apple give you access? I'm on the camp saying I don't think so. I think you're pointing out these things way too fast, but I know you're heavily invested in privacy as well. Was that something you've always been interested in, or did that came following basically building iOS apps?
So the privacy things, it kind of started, I don't even know how, I just got interested in it. So in the beginning, very early on, I didn't like the privacy heavy Europe. I was like, oh, this is annoying, like only because somebody takes a photo and you're on it, like I don't care. I was always, I don't know, more eager about the American way, and it was like, let's just get things done. And then, after a while, you realize, okay, this probably makes sense. And so because of my years of experience building iPhone apps, you kind of understand the permission system, like requesting access to the camera, requesting access to a microphone, and so on. And all I did, oh yeah, just to step back a little bit, one of the projects I've been doing as a side project was looking into potential privacy loopholes on iPhone. And I always just published those. I always gave Apple a heads up on like, hey, this is what I found. Like, let me know if it's okay to, like, if I should not publish it. Like, realistically, all these things were not actual bugs, though. It was not like I hacked something. But if it's actually a day zero, like security vulnerability, like that would be a different story. But what I did is just basically almost like social engineering, as in tricking the user into doing something without them knowing, just based on how the permission system works. And it was kind of like a fun challenge. Like, these are the constraints you have, and this is what you're trying to do, or what is the worst you could do with that? So one example was, if you have, if you select photos through your app, the iPhone the app by default got access to all your photos. And one of the information every single photo of your iPhone stores is the location data. And so I was like, okay, I have like 10,000 photos on my phone. How long does it take to just query all of these and get all the location data? Well, it turns out like less than 2 seconds. And you have like the whole history of where the user has been the last like years. And I don't know, it kind of felt exciting, and I started digging into that more and I published those. And the interesting thing also was like how people reacted, because many iOS developers, especially the really smart ones, were like, yeah, obviously, like if you grant permission to your photos, they get that, right? Like it's attached to the photo. But then it actually got into the mainstream media, and all the people who are not developers are like, whoa, no, that's not okay. And the
Right.
developers knew about it. And so the thing is, nothing that I pointed out is like brand new. Like all of this has existed, and a lot of these people already knew. It was just about like, okay, how could you abuse that system? And the great thing was, as a result, Apple has fixed every single one of these issues in different ways. Some of them in annoying ways, like for example, the Mac, you now have an extra pop-up if an app has access to your screen. But previously there was no pop-up, so your app could just access your screen at any time without asking. Yeah, that was like one of my side projects in the last few years.
It's imagine having a side problem, being so invested that Apple actually listens to it. Like, you know what? Maybe we should fix it because you got the traction. Like, obviously, that's what I love about your Twitter. Is like people are reading this. Like, you're known now for being the guy with the stick. It was like, I think I'm seeing something that's like you said with the pictures. You're like, well, yeah, you request access to the photos, but there's metadata in there in these photos that you as a user probably don't even know about, and you don't know that this is what access you're also granting. So I feel like this is like that's something where I feel like your job is so important. It's like obviously you're such an influential role in there. And seeing that Apple listens and Apple adjusts these things, I'm excited to see what else you're gonna find in the new stuff. I feel like WWDC for you, I'm looking at it as like, oh, this is exciting. I feel like for you, it's just a new challenge. Like you're gonna watch me, like, you know what? I don't think that's right. Is that how you see it now?
No, I actually stopped doing projects. It got really exhausting.
Okay.
It might sound stupid, but because it was not only like viral within the iOS community, but it went viral like outside the
Yeah.
bubble. You attract people I don't want to interact with on Twitter. And so it just got really exhausting, replying and stuff. And one thing, for example, I'm still living with, one of the posts I've published is about how you can hijack an Apple ID just using showing a pop-up. Like I was basically saying like, hey, if you want somebody's Apple ID password, just ask them. Like people are used to entering it because it randomly pops up, right? So that is something that's actually fixed now. But 2 years ago, literally every week you would get that pop-up out of nowhere. And so I published that, and turns out a lot of people Google how to hack like their son's Apple ID or something, and it would reach out to me asking for help and stuff. And so these are the things like I don't want to do it.
That's not what you want to be involved with. That's such a higher goal. I just want to take you, like I'm realizing, obviously, like especially like being in the iOS field myself, I could talk for hours about this because like I'm super excited about this. But I just want to take a quick step back on how did it start with Fastlane? Was that something you've now built? You've been building iOS apps and you already got fed up like in the beginning with, I know in the beginning the review cycle was even worse. Was that something you just realized, you know what, like I just don't have the time to sit around?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what I talked about at the first question, which is I was for one of the apps I was building, I needed a backend, and so I was looking into solutions for that, and Ruby on Rails was like the way to go back then. And when I looked into how to actually run the backend in production, I found Heroku, which I think most of you will know. And so in Heroku, it's very easy to host your Ruby on Rails application. And when I looked through how to deploy your code, it was like, yeah, just like add that git remote and then just run git push, right? And like, it's like we'll do a rolling deploy for you. And that's when I realized, whoa, wait, like it's not that easy for iPhone apps. And I was aware, like obviously you have, as you mentioned, the review cycle. Like, you can't do like 10 deploys a day, but still you could make it a lot easier. And so that's kind of like how I started thinking about it. And so I just took some of these concepts and applied it to iPhone apps. And you can actually check out, I published like a little website that's called iOSfactor.com, and there's a dash in between iOS and Factor, and it's inspired by 12-factor app, which is the same for backend applications, which kind of it kind of writes about those processes on how deployment should work and stuff. but it's the same concept. It's like I only learned Ruby on Rails and Heroku because I needed it to get the job done. And as part of that, I kind of like realized, wait, I can apply the same thing that backend developers have been doing for years and just
Yeah.
apply similar concepts to iPhone apps.
Just for like the people who don't know about it yet, and I didn't know that you were the founder of that up until very recently. It's like iOS Factors basically, and I'm gonna link all the sources because there's a lot about you and your projects. I'm gonna probably link all the sources wherever I'm gonna post this, but they are gonna be attached to it. But iOS Factor basically is, and I think it's one of those things you as when you get started you don't even know they exist. So this is more like a almost like let's say like the best practice of how to build like not in oh, this is the syntax you'll use, but more on how do you design an app? How do you design, not in a visual way, but on like a technical standpoint. And I didn't know about this, and that's been something that blew my mind. Like when I started working with people who are so much smarter than me, and building larger platforms to understand, oh, there's actually a structure and a system you should follow and adhere to make it sustainable, make it maintainable and stable and all these things. So this is something you founded. This is something that's live on the website. I'm going to link the website to it. How was it for you then now with like you built Fastlane, it grew, and I'm going to now skip probably a bunch of steps, but it grew. I think you started almost from your dorm, right? Was that a just a like was that an official college project or was it something you just built on the
Yeah,
side?
it actually was. It was a bachelor's project. So I
Oh,
got my graduation through Fastlane. Initially, it was supposed to only be Deliver, which is one of the Fastlane tools. And so that was only about uploading a binary, screenshots, and app metadata. But even during the project, I talked with my professor and I was allowed to release the first version before the end of the semester. And so I launched it, and he was actually very supportive on, building new tools around it and like expanding the scope of the project. And yeah, even during that time, you could just see and feel how everybody who saw it was like, "Whoa, this is so cool! Like, I want to use this." And there's actually one thing that I really enjoyed about this is that I was already building iPhone apps for like 3 or 4 years at this point, but I still, knew that there's like a lot of people who are really smart. And sometimes you Google something, like for example, how to create a push notification certificate, which is like something very basic. You just want to send push notification to your iPhone app, and you Google that, and I think to this day on Stack Overflow, the first result, an answer that simplifies Apple's documentation, and it's like I think it's like 15 steps or something. It's like opening up the macOS keychain, like clicking on a little triangle, right click, export, running random terminal commands, some OpenSSL commands to like encrypt something. And when I went through this, I was like, there's just no way this is the official way of doing it. And instead of just asking on Twitter, I'm like, is this the right way? Like, does this make sense? I just built a tool that literally is a single command. It's just like create a push notification certificate for this app. Like that's all it needs. It doesn't need more. And I built it, and I actually expected that when I launch this, people, the community is gonna be like, "What the hell, Felix? Like, you can just do this right in Xcode. Like, just click here, right?" That's what I
like you
expected.
didn't even know yet that that is the actual way. Yeah.
Yeah, I assumed that there is some truth to it, but I assumed there must be a better way. And so when I launched it, that was not the direction at all. People were not mad at me for being stupid. They were literally like, "Whoa, wait! Like, this is just a single command. That is so cool." And it's this whole thing on like, don't ask for help, but just provide a solution and see how people correct it or something. It's a joke, obviously. But I kind of use that a lot. I was like, I'm not sure if this is the right way, but I'll just give it a go.
It sounds like from the theme that I'm getting from you that you're very like I mean obviously also from your like your character like you're very optimistic forward looking. Is that also something? It doesn't sound like because I remember it's very easy to get started and especially push notifications, and I know it's something I had to Google a lot of times in the beginning, and then everything like keychain, everything like certificate management, but it sounds always like you see the problem and you don't really treat it as a problem. You're like, you know what, I know how I could improve it. Is that something you do on like a general basis to not really treat the problem as like
Yeah.
a wall, but more like how can I solve it?
Yeah, I think so. I think usually I also think very optimistically, as in, oh, it's only like this and this, and so usually I cover only a single use case, kind of like it's not going to cover any edge cases. But the way I see it, especially with open source software and like a very small project like this, you kind of just launch, and then people are going to submit issues. People are going to reply like, hey, what about enterprise certificates, right? And
Yeah.
I didn't even have access to an enterprise account back then. So stuff like that, and it just grows over time. One thing that I did with all the Fastlane tools, which has proven really, really helpful, was I actually did, I don't know if it's an official term, I call it README-driven development, even better than test-driven development. So I write the README first. So for every tool I launched, I wrote the documentation on how to use it first. And the documentation basically just had like a bunch of example commands with a description on what parameters you provide. And that's been super helpful because the way, at least Apple back then, I'm not super up to date anymore, but back then, the way to build tools is like, we have this database of provisioning profiles. How do we expose it to the users? And then it just did like a CRUD interface. I'm like, yeah, you can create it, you can delete it, stuff like that. But that's not how developers think. They just want the provisioning profile to build their app. Like they don't care about what's happening underneath.
Yeah.
And with the README-driven approach, you kind of are forced to think like, okay, I'm an iOS developer. What am I trying to achieve? What problem is this solving? And like, how do I use it?
Is it, that's, oh my God, that's something that blows my mind because I've been reading, and this is more like from, this is now putting the bridge like for everyone entrepreneurial minded. What I hear from this is like you go, like you think about your customers pretty much thinking, hey, how is the customer going to use it? And then work like the technical steps backwards into, okay, how, what do I need to add now that I know where I want to go? I mean, TDD, like we engineers know that, but I love that you, like, you don't come up with something and then build it and then realize, oh, I can't really build it this way. I love that you say, hey, this is how you will use it. And then now I only have to figure out how to get there.
Yeah.
I love this backwards approach.
And it helps you build it also because you think about the problem differently. You already know what kind of options you want to have. So for example, for the push notification project, like it was very clear from the day I started that you need to handle an existing push notification certificate because you will need a flag to say, do you want to replace it? Do you want to revoke it? Something like this. So it's stuff like that. If you were to just start building a push notification CLI, command line interface, right, you would just potentially just get started until people run into the problem of, oh, I already have one, right? But I think if you are forced to think like the user, the customer of the product, it really helps you.
How's it now? Because I know we're like about to reach the end, so I basically just want to, there's so many like lessons in there, so I'm kind of want to touch like maybe two more points. How was it for you then, the change from you work on your own project, and I know it's been open source and people been are contributing to it, but now a company reaches out to you and says, hey, do you want to work on this in the US? How did that change your approach, or did it even change the approach once you then were working with Twitter on Fastlane?
I think the biggest change is that it was a larger team. Like before that, it was just me. Obviously, if it's a single person team, everything's easier. So there was more process involved, obviously, but also it was more serious, right? Suddenly it wasn't just a random Austrian guy in a dorm room building an open source software, right? Suddenly it's Twitter making the project. So obviously also the quality and yeah, how stable the product is plays a much more critical role. I think it was that. And the second piece is probably, I mean, this is very specific to this situation of open source at a large company. But if you work on any open source software at a company like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and so on, you do have to think about the company's interests, which don't have to be bad, right? Like, for example, also at Google, it was never Google's intention to get any data from that. It was never Google's intentions to make directly money with that, right? For them, it might be enough that I make the case on like, hey, if we like maintain Fastlane and like build cool stuff on top, we're gonna get so much like positive attitude from like iOS developers that it will help you sell this other service to them or something, right? Even that is good enough if I can like have ways to describe it and they say like, oh yeah, this makes sense. But that's obviously also a change. Before that, I didn't have that, and now you also have to consider the interest of the company that's actually supporting your project.
Was it then for you after you integrated with these firms? I can only imagine because when we got acquired, our startup got acquired by Goldman, so we went from just a bunch of people having fun kind of to working for a corporation. So I can only imagine how it was for you bringing your own project in there. Were you then still hands-on actually developing, or was it more for you then almost on the managerial side of I have to now kind of defend my ideas to like the corporate world, to Google or Twitter?
I think it was handled really well. So I was always actually also coding on Fastlane. That never changed. I also never wanted to be in a manager role of any sort, so that's
Yeah.
something I made clear early on. Obviously, I did play. I mean, at Google they call it like team lead or something, or tech lead. I don't know, where you kind of like you don't have the responsibility of managing, but you still have a say on like architecture stuff and like strategic stuff. So I really like that because you can always kind of like leave a conversation if you don't like it. Um, but otherwise, they handle it pretty well. I know that's probably not that common, I would say, but because of the nature of the project, like I made sure that it's 100% open source, that it's independent from the rest. Like for example, Twitter had Fabric and Pushletics, right? And then Google has Firebase. Obviously, they wanted to integrate it into those services, which also ended up happening. Like it does have bad integrations to those services, but we never force anything on anyone. We don't make it the default, stuff like that. So they handled it really well. And there was actually never really a big misalignment when it comes to that.
I'm curious because you obviously like you've seen different phases through like you've seen the project grow. I know you have like Fastlane, I think has over 900 contributors. So it's like you've worked with a lot of people. You obviously ran your own teams. Like you had to hire. And now for the more junior people who want to maybe work for a large company, I'm always curious, what are the things you're looking for when you hire? What are you looking for in a person for a junior or whatever position?
I also have to say, I was not that involved in hiring, so what I'm saying doesn't have a lot of value. Obviously, I was involved in some conversations. I think for me personally, it's a lot also on just the energy and excitement and care somebody puts in, which is of course really hard to measure. But from my experience, when you work in teams, after hiring, like if you already work in a team, right? If you only have like one or two people who kind of just do the minimum, or it's kind of like just they are present in meetings, right? But they're not actively contributing, and
Hmm.
you just know that they don't really care about it. I think that's the worst thing, to be honest, for everybody involved. And so, again, it's really hard to measure. I think the energy, and so I think that there's a lot of talk, a lot of conversation on Twitter on like, oh, you should contribute to open source projects in your free time, right? So you show that you care, that you built something. And I think that's obviously tricky, right? Like if you have a day job, if you have other obligations outside of work, it's tricky, right? But I think it's all just a proxy for that you care about the stuff you do. I think there's a lot of other ways that you can do that without having to spend that extra time, right? But
That's
again, that's really hard to measure, and I wasn't involved in hiring in those two companies, so I can't say too much about it.
I love it though how you put it, because it's basically like even if you're not the person hiring, it's technically like it was your baby, you grew, and so you had to, and obviously you're working together with the right people, so there's clearly whatever you're looking for has like some essence to it, and it made it happen. So that's a perfect answer. That's something I feel like I always love hearing, and I hear more and more often now that people really look for like everyone says like the cultural fit, but like the energy, the care, like you said. I love hearing this, and I think for everyone watching who is now really it can get like you can get really caught up in all these details you have to learn. Getting the macro view of care about it, and obviously that leads you down the road where you actually now start learning the right things, is fantastic insight. One last thing I want to cover, and then I'm gonna let you go, is because I know you're like everyone who knows me on Instagram knows I'm a huge tracker. Like I like tracking my personal performance. I like tracking all these things, but I am nothing compared to Felix, who I would coin the term the god of tracking, because you even have your own website, and I love the whereisfelix.com, where you can see your health data, your travel data, your speaking gigs. Like this is, I feel like if you like tracking, Felix obviously the go-to guy. I'm curious though, why did you start tracking it? And I have my own answer, and I'm curious to hear your answer. And have you noticed any benefits from it, or is it just a fun thing?
Yeah, I've always been interested in that topic, and I don't even know why. I just haven't. I remember as a little kid, I was thinking like, oh, I wish I would know how many steps I took in my whole life. Like, well,
Yeah,
I'll never, right?
interesting.
But I don't know why, but this question just popped into my head. And then, the first product, obviously with smartphones, that was more and more like very early on, you could track your sleep cycles with like, back on iOS 2, like in a really terrible way, I think. But
Was
I was,
it still with having the phone next to you on the
yeah,
pillow?
exactly. I think it got like really warm and stuff. It was super sketchy, but it kind of worked.
Yeah.
So I was always interested in that. And I think the first real product that came out that kind of did what I was interested in was Gyroscope, which you probably know, with April Zero, like he built that. Um, I was a very eager user at the beginning, but very soon I realized that the founder, like he kind of just wants to keep it as a closed platform, like to do what they wanted to do. And with this exact nature of project data that you're trying to collect, it's just not an option, I think. Like you should own the data. You should be able to really do very custom things because it is your data. You might collect different data over time. There is no product that fits all, I think. And so if you follow the subreddit called Quantified Self, every week there's somebody like, oh, like I didn't like what's out there, so I built my own whatever tracking, right? And it's always like a very close-minded, like very specific app or something that doesn't even allow you to export data. It's kind of interesting to see. The subreddit itself doesn't provide a lot of value, I think, so it doesn't seem like a lot of people doing that. And so what I did was just like, wait, so life is basically just a timestamp based key value store, as in you have a key and a value. So key would be like your sleep duration, how many hours you slept tonight. The value would be 8 hours, and a timestamp, which would be basically the morning when you wake up and you enter that number. And one tricky piece I always had in mind with all this software, including like smartwatches, is time zones. When you fly around a lot, it messes with your data. So one core principle I had is like, I don't want to be bound on a time zone or a day or a time. So everything is just time stamps, literally time stamps, like that's it. And then you can match the closest ones. You can match something like sleep duration, 8 hours, to the closest entry on how many calories you ate or how many drinks of alcohol you had or something. But they're not tightly connected. So it's a really dumb database, but it works just wonderfully. Like it's great. And so I've been collecting that data for like 2 years, and then the happiness data for like 3, 4 years. And then I have a bunch of like importers that allow you to import existing data. For example, Foursquare Swarm, I've been using that for like 11 years or something. So I have all my history of where I've been, and number of steps, for example, from Apple Health and so on.
Yeah. And have you noticed, like, is it something you then review? Is it something you just want to track and get like an overview of, hey, what have I done? Or is it now, because I know you're working with a personal trainer and I know I've been following you over the last years, you make gains. Like this is something like you're growing even as in like an athlete. Is it something you now use the data to review? Like you said, how is your sleep affected by the alcohol consumption? Is it something you just want to know?
So I have to admit, I didn't spend too much time looking through the data yet, because I think the key piece is you have to start collecting it. Because if you don't collect it today, you will never get the data from today, right? So the first step was, so I built most of that in between Google and my current job, where I took like 2 or 3 months off. And so I was working on that. And then I just didn't get to building the whole like dashboard to like look into the data. I built like a basic one. And I actually built one recently that actually finds correlations. And so it's very interesting. It's stuff like, for example, if you go out one night and actually drink alcoholic drinks, for example, right? Obviously, the chances of like having headache or like feeling exhausted like the day after like is obviously higher. So you can clearly see that in the data. But then you also see some other metrics that are actually affected. So for example, the food you eat and so on. I can send you some information afterwards because I haven't actually published those yet. But yeah, so to your question, I don't have any actually actionable insights yet because I just haven't spent the time on it yet. Right now, mostly just collecting.
But this is like you said, the most important part for getting these insights is actually having the data and having the like large enough quantity of data to actually make sense of them. So that's something I love about your site. Obviously, I'm gonna get everything that's out there from you, pretty much everything that's interesting for us iOS engineers, for everyone getting started. Obviously, Fastlane is going to be a link I'm going to put in there. I'm going to also add in the info, I'm going to add your website. Your, if you don't mind, is Where is Felix? Is that a site you actually want to share? Or is that something you just
want to Where is Felix today? And also the project we just talked about for tracking, that's also open source and like self-hosted. It's definitely not easy to use. So just as a heads up, you have to be an engineer and you have to be willing to spend some hours setting things up and like playing around with it.
That's awesome. But I'm definitely gonna touch everything. I think this has been awesome, Felix. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you so much, obviously, for the impact you had and the impact you're making now in the future with the new projects you're working on. There's obviously so much more we would like to know, but I want to be respectful. We already went over like with your time. I think we all learned a lot, how to get started, what are the things you're looking for, what are the things as an engineer also, like how do you approach problems, how do you approach solutions. This is very dense. To sum things up, guys, like now, like all the information that we just got from Felix, like is coming from someone who actually has proven these things. Like it's not someone who has just an idea, maybe want to play around. Felix has seen pretty much every angle of it. He started in the dorm, like he said, and he's done the same thing at Twitter. He's done the same thing at Google. He's done like he's now. I feel like you're giving a lot of talks. Like I don't know how it is with COVID, but before then, it's like you're like talking, you're traveling all over the world giving these talks. So this is data, and again, this is like actual data coming from someone who's seen it, who's walked these steps. So take this advice from him. Don't listen to me, obviously, ever. Listen to these people who know much more about this. Felix, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I mentioned earlier, I know you said we weren't live yet, but you got a haircut before you actually got live. I still will believe you did it just for this, just to look good for us for these 20 minutes. No, again, thank you so much for taking the time and opening up and also sharing with like the next generation on how to approach these things.
Oh, thank you.